Hello, I'm Jeffrey Henning, the Chief Marketing Officer of Athenova. I've been a market researcher since the 1980s and have been doing surveys for 24 years and online surveys for about 15 years. And I'm pleased to be kicking off the NewMR Festival. And maybe it's a little ironic that we're kicking it off looking at an old technique like surveys, but I think there's some new life we can breathe into it. So I'm going to talk to you today about crowd-shaped surveys. Adapting the experience of the survey for later respondents based on what prior respondents did. So if we think about the spirit of the web and contrast that to surveys, one of the things that I love as sort of a representative of what the web can do is Wikipedia. And one of the areas that Wikipedia really shines when compared to Encyclopedia Britannica and traditional encyclopedias is, since it's not limited by space, it can devote articles to esoteric pop culture kind of topics. And this was an example of an article that was originally called Heavy Metal Umlaut. It's been renamed to Metal Umlaut, but it was started back in April 15th, 2003, where someone said, hey, the Heavy Metal Umlaut over the O and the names of Motorhead and the Blue Oyster Cult. And they went on to talk about that. So that was a first article that someone created, and then they, within about an hour and a half, someone had seen that article was created, and they expanded it. They knew who had coined this term, and they linked to an article about them, and they added more links, and they added Motley Crue. So already they're leveraging what other people have entered and expanding on it. By about 2 weeks later, someone has expanded the article even further. They've mentioned that Spinal Tap made fun of this whole thing with umlaut over the letter N. They mentioned some other bands and the use of nu metal with an umlaut, and they referenced a site called Rock Dots, which talked about that in more detail. So they've contributed, and then not everyone understands how to use wikis. Here, a month later, someone has asked a question. The article's expanded a little, and someone's like, "Hey, what is the O character called? The vowel in Scandinavian languages?" And not really the place. There's a talk page to do that, but they added it there. And someone else who really didn't understand Wikipedia software answered it, or thought they answered it. And then eventually that got edited out. So sometimes the article moves forward, sometimes it moves backwards, somebody catches it and fixes it. And the result is that by about a year and a half later, it's a recognizable article. It's got a picture, it's got structured content, goes into the history, other references, other bands that have this, how it's been used in pop culture, other articles that you can see, external links, and a whole bar of related heavy metal content that you can go review. So it's become a recognizable article. And when I did this a few weeks ago, you can see it's over 3 pages long, in incredible detail on this very esoteric subject of metal umlaut. So I think that captures sort of the sort of collaboration and co-creation that's possible on the web. But now imagine if you were doing that as an online survey. So you ask a question to your respondents, how would you define metal umlaut, and you get an answer, and then you ask someone else, and you get another answer, and again and again and again, and you're not really converging on anything. And that's fine most of the time when we're doing research, when we really just want to know what that person thinks. But there are certainly more and more opportunities where we want people to collaborate, where it would have been better had we done something outside of the traditional survey technique. So my request for you all, so your assignment, is to think about how we can bring the spirit of the web to online surveys better than we have in the past. Because really where we are today, 99% of online surveys that people take, they unfold the same way for the respondent, whether the respondent was the first person to take the survey or the last person to take the survey. Sure, they might see some different questions based on skip patterns, based on their answers, but if you're the 1,000th person taking the survey, you're not leveraging or benefiting from the fact that 999 people took it before you. And so most surveys today, they're not providing much in the way of qualitative exercises. They're providing even less in the way of co-creation. So your assignment, how can you make your surveys adapt to early responses, to better serve later respondents, or to provide better data? Can you give online surveys the spirit of the web? And to get you started thinking about how you might do that, I'm going to give you 7 examples of crowd-shaped surveys. that hopefully will get your creative juices flowing. So the first one I'm calling question baskets. So if you've ever designed a survey where you've involved other people, you know, the questionnaire designed by committee can produce very long instruments. And we had sort of a survey that was ending with an aside, and something that we wanted to just kind of squeeze in. And then we had a bunch of open-ended questions that we wanted to ask about this final topic that we'd introduced. But you know, we didn't want to make the survey horribly long and ask them all. So we prioritized them, and what we did was we basically came up with cascading quotas per question. So the first respondents, the first 100 respondents would see an open-ended question, what did you like about this? And then once we had 100 responses collected to that, we closed that question, and then instead they would see what did you dislike about this? And we did that for the first 400 respondents. So each of the first 400 respondents saw only one of these questions. We kept it open until we had basically gotten 100 responses, which we thought was a nice group of verbatim data. Wouldn't require onerous work coding, but would give us a really good qualitative feel for what people were thinking. And the later respondents, you know, didn't see any of these because we collected enough data. So, so they got the benefit of a shorter survey because of the work of the earlier respondents. So that's questions in baskets. The second technique I wanted to introduce was crowdsourced choice lists. So one of the things that can be very hard about writing a good questionnaire is coming up with the exact choices that you should use in your closed-ended questions. So I was doing some research on the Atkins diet. I've shared this example in the past. It was something I didn't know much about. I actually went to social media, found out how people were talking about the Atkins diet on Twitter to kind of frame some of the reasons people might be avoiding it. But while I was trying to create a closed-ended question like that, you know, certainly there were things that I missed that emerged from the other. Now imagine if you automated this so that when people added an other, later respondents could see it. So think about using the other to collect your choices and to sort of evolve better choices. Over time, you know, you'd show sort of the 10 most frequently selected choices. In that other box, you could autocomplete to show some of the ones that weren't being shown but had been entered before, so it has a database of choices. Obviously, when you're doing that, how you're going to analyze it is going to be a little different because not everyone's going to see the exact same choices, so it's going to be more qualitative than quantitative, but it's going to develop into a much smarter version of the questionnaire by the end of the survey than it was by the beginning based on how people have selected it. And that takes me to another example of sort of choice lists evolving over time, and that's the projective technique known as laddering. So if we look at crowdsourced laddering, and one of the themes here is some of these are old survey research techniques that have kind of been forgotten, and I'd like to see them be given some new life. So this technique actually was patented by a brain juicer, and I think 2004 is the patent, but I think it dates back even further, as you can see from this old screenshot. So in a projective technique, you're constantly probing on why people said something. So you basically have to develop a tree of closed-ended responses, which would just be impossible for a questionnaire designer to do with any degree of certainty. So here the question is, thinking about growing your business, in which area would you find information or assistance most useful? They can select from one of the existing choices. They can add their own. Here they're doing selecting finding business partners, which is one that has been frequently selected. So then they get a follow-on probing question, thinking about finding business partners, in which area would you find information assistance most useful? And here's some of the choices that other people had entered in, and they can then enter in their own choice or select a choice. And the next one, they're the first person to be confronted with this follow-on probe, thinking about pre-screen candidates, in which area would you find information assistance most useful? So they don't have any choices to select from. They're going to type in the first choice, and then later respondents are going to see it. So at the end, you have a very rich library of choices drilling down in detail, probing in detail for respondents. So they call that, the brain juicer calls that their mind reader technique. So another example of sort of open-end exploration is comment exploration from GMI. So they have basically a part of their questionnaire, an object where you can read and evaluate other people's comments. over time, then they can be screened out. So you can see these comments. You can click musician, and she's the most successful female entrepreneur there is. They click on that, and then they can say whether they agree or disagree. And then there's a portal that they can use to moderate the results. The other two techniques that I just talked about, if a respondent typed in an obscenity or something that was politically incorrect or inappropriate, later respondents would see it. Here with GMI's technique, there's actually a moderation panel where you can go and review the comments that have been entered and basically say, yep, that's approved. Subsequent respondents can see it. So they call it text sanctioning. It does require, that you have sort of a researcher regularly logging into the survey and seeing what's been added and approving it going forward. But obviously it's going to give you higher quality control. So that's comment exploration. So then the fourth technique that I wanted to talk about is idea exploration. And the canonical example really of an idea community or an idea exchange is my Starbucks idea. And I love going back to it, even though it's been referenced so many times, just to see the growth in it. And here you can see tens of thousands of ideas grouped by coffee, teas and other drinks, frappuccino, food, merchandise, music. So far more ideas than the organization can actually act on. And really, unfortunately, most of these idea portals do a very poor job at providing ways for people to sort of rate and assess these. So you can see the most popular ideas, the most recent ideas, scroll across the home page very briefly and have a short window to capture people's attention. You can search ideas and vote them up or down. But given the sheer number of ideas, there's no easy way to evaluate them all. We've experimented with using pairwise comparison, where people see two random ideas and say which one they like better, and then you evaluate the ideas based on how likely they are to beat a randomly selected alternative idea, so that can prioritize them. In terms of having surveys, we've looked at surveys that say if you were looking specifically at the tea and other drink category, there's 8,000 ideas. You wanted to sort of present people 30 ideas and have them pick the most popular, and you wanted to sort of use the earlier responses that were picked, make them more likely to show up in later lists. It does require very large sample sizes when you do that, so typically tens of thousands of responses. So it's not a technique that works for most brands, but simply because ideas are too discrete. Each idea is too individual, and so it's very hard to generalize or structure them. So so that's a more difficult technique. Interestingly, if we move on to concept exploration, there's now structure around concepts, so it makes it easier to evaluate very large spaces. So here we have a mock concept for a medical device. It's got attributes, insight, positioning, product benefits, product image, features, clinical endpoint. And now think if you had sort of two ideas for each of these, you'd have 64 combinations of possible unique concepts. If you had 3 ideas for each, you'd have 729. If you had 7 ideas for each of these and you were showing them, you'd have over 117,000. In fact, yesterday I was involved in an ideation where we were working on a concept, just brainstorming ideas, not evaluating them. So we would trim it. But out of the ideation process, when we did the math, we had 187 billion possible combinations of these concepts. So when you hear that kind of number, you think, well, how the heck can you ever evaluate that? Well, there's actually a whole category of mathematical techniques called search algorithms that you can use that are going to take early responses from respondents and change what later respondents see. So, and those are typically called optimization techniques. So rather than try to measure the whole space, so if you were thinking of, you were going to use a conjoint technique for this, in conjoint you're trying to make sure that every variant is used, say, 3 times, and you're trying to simulate this space. And when you simulate it, you're going to have some ideas that you think are top concepts that are going to come close, but you're kind of sampling and a stratified sampling of this space because it's so large. So you're not exactly going to get the entire thing. The alternative, if you use a search algorithm, is you're actually searching the map to find the preferred concepts. So you're not trying to understand the entire landscape. I mean, if you're interested in new products or the right way to market something, the right way to message it, you're really interested in the top concepts. So instead, you're quickly converging on the top concepts, and you're ignoring the topography underneath. You're just not going to understand it. And the way that you can do that with a survey is to use a search algorithm. We happen to use a genetic search algorithm, evolutionary optimization. So imagine that respondents have picked, anytime they're sort of shown 4 concepts, ask which one they like the best, those become parent concepts because we're using the analogy of evolution. So the first parent concept will contribute some of its DNA, some of its attributes to a child concept. The other parent will contribute some of its attributes. And then, just to make sure that we're not leaving things out that didn't survive in earlier concepts but maybe have a niche with some others, we have some random mutations that we use as well. Just like, you know, when you're arguing over your child and whether they're more like you or your spouse, and every now and then they have something that's sort of like their crazy uncle, you know, it's that random variation. So then that new concept is shown to later respondents. So what later respondents see is change based on the early respondents, and you're more quickly converging into concepts that are more popular. So if you think about all of the concepts, so imagine this is hundreds of thousands of concepts, each representing a unique permutation of the attributes. So far too many to measure with the survey. But what you can do is you can create an initial parent population similar to the conjoint that sort of has stratified sampling of it. So you're making sure that you're getting representation of the possibilities of these concepts. And then you can have respondents start to evaluate some of these initial randomly selected concepts. And as they select them and react to them, what's going to happen is they're going to start to hone in on the concepts that are most popular. And they're quickly going to find the top concepts that have the greatest appeal. And in fact, we can do that between 350 and 600 interviews, because you very quickly converge on the most popular concepts, because there are certain concepts that just die off very quickly and make the search space smaller and smaller and smaller, and that process keeps happening. So that's how you're using those early results to shape the later results. Basically, without realizing it, respondents are collaborating with one another and sort of passing on their work to the respondents who come after them. So that's concept exploration. And then the last technique I want to talk about is adaptive questionnaires, which actually is an old technique. I found literature going back to the 1980s about this process, where in the 1980s they would take a very long battery of ratings questions, and over time they would see which of those were most divergent. The answers were least predictable based on the answers to other questions, and they would randomly be asking these in different orders, and they would start to move the ones that were more divergent up to the front, so that if people were abandoning the survey, they were getting the answers that were going to be hardest to predict first. And so if people dropped out of the survey, the question batteries that weren't answered by them were easier to sort of estimate from the ones that they had answered. So now you can imagine applying this to enterprise feedback management, EFM questionnaires, which are very different from sort of general market research surveys, in that they often have very large sample sizes. So I've seen customer satisfaction surveys related to transactions with hundreds of thousands, millions of responses. And so often those questionnaires are designed and then just kind of left in a static form. Well, imagine instead that you're leveraging what you're learning from all these other respondents. So there's some length optimization. If the people are dropping out of the survey, then you start to hide some of the questions that are less important, or hide the questions that are causing higher abandonment. If in fact people are sticking with the survey, maybe you can add some of those lower priority questions back dynamically. question optimization, hiding open-ended questions once you have sufficient verbatims collected. We had one survey that was very large. It was a website feedback survey, and we were doing some research when I was at FOBC looking at text analytics, and we were asking them what techniques they were using to analyze these verbatims. And in fact, they weren't analyzing the verbatims. There were far too many of them. So that's a question that should have been closed. They had just been sort of randomly sampling it. So they should, if you're only going to be randomly sampling responses, don't ask everyone it or cap it at a certain level. And again, get rid of questions that cause abandonment. So those are just some different ways. Hopefully, it will get you thinking about the online surveys that you're doing and how you can leverage the early respondents to shape what the later respondents are seeing, what I call crowd-shaped surveys. It's a shame today that most surveys don't adapt, especially these surveys that have very long, very large sample sizes. I think using a survey that then ends in a qualitative exercise where people are editing a wiki page or adding to a community or seeing basically what others have done is going to give you some richer data that you can't answer in a traditional technique. So while 3 of these techniques date back to 2001 and before, I think they deserve a fresh look, and hopefully they'll inspire you to think about some things that you can do with your own surveys. So again, my assignment for you is can you create online surveys that better embody the spirit of the web? Thank you very much.